Now with our second presentation, we're privileged to have Jenna Williams from the University of Ottawa to come share with us. Her topic is racial prejudice in Christian worship and exploration of Christian classical leisure. All right, so Jenna, you are up.
Hi everyone and welcome. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll make sure that it looks okay and everything. Can you all see that?
We can now, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, welcome to Racial Prejudice and Christian Worship, an exploration of a social dimension of Christian classical leisure. My name is Jenna Williams, and I'm a recent graduate from the University of Ottawa with a Bachelor in Social Science and International Development with a minor in Economics. Actually, I'm jumping the gun a bit. If you were in Hannah's presentation, she said our commencement is tonight, and so I'm saying I'm a graduate, but I am graduating tonight. I'm also an incoming master's candidate in political economy at Carleton University. Generally, I'm fascinated by people, community development, and cycles of wealth and poverty. I'm here today because I took a class called Leisure and Spirituality with Professor Paul Heintzman in my final semester as an elective. It was in this class that I heard of the classical concept of leisure, and I found it fascinating. And this interest only increased when we read Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture. This presentation is based on the final research paper that I wrote for this class, where I looked at an issue that is often studied in the realm of social science, racial prejudice, from the philosophical framework of Pieper's concept of leisure. So a bit of background. Classical leisure is often referred to as leisure as a state of being. For example, Christian philosopher Pieper defines it as a condition of the soul that finds its basis and vitality in worship. This is different than Aristotle's concept of classical leisure that was primarily concerned about seeking truth as a means of becoming at peace with oneself. The Christian concept of leisure is to know God and to know his presence within, not just to know about God or about divine truth, as Aristotle was concerned with. But time and time again, studies have shown that ethnic minorities do not feel at home or included in ethnic majority church congregations. Knowing that churches remain quite ethnically and racially segregated to this day, in the leisure and spirituality class, I started questioning things that could act as social barriers to attaining Christian classical concept of leisure. I also found that Christian discussions of classical leisure rarely included an analysis of racial prejudice and segregation in spaces of worship. This presentation will demonstrate that the classical leisure perspective is an important angle to consider when exploring the dynamics of racial segregation in churches. So the research question that I developed for my paper was, are there impediments for ethnic minorities in reaching leisure that is a mental and spiritual attitude, a condition of the soul, a receptive attitude of mind, when they are in ethnically homogeneous congregations different than their own ethnicity? I quickly realized that measuring the classical concept of leisure it feels impossible, and that a far better way to make accurate observations may have been through qualitative interviews. However, there was some tying of theory that could be commenced in my short research paper. I'd like to make a few disclaimers. The first one is that clearly I am not a part of a minority group. I am a white Canadian woman, and so I don't have experiences of racism in the church or outside of the church. Second disclaimer is that I'm not American, but I did use a lot of American statistics because a lot of the literature on American segregation in the church, they are American studies. And the third is that I am an undergraduate student, so this is definitely an exploratory research paper. So I had three themes that I wanted to explore when I was addressing this question. The first was really defining and understanding Joseph Pieper's concept of classical leisure. Then I looked at literature on ethnic and racial dimensions of leisure. This would help me to give language to some of the observations that I made during my third area of exploration, which is a case study that looked at an attempted church merger. This offered understanding of the often unspoken racial dynamics between white and Black American Christians. I will apply the classical leisure framework to this case study to explore the potential impacts that this scenario had on the attainment of classical leisure for congregants of this attempted church merger. But the first one we'll look at is Joseph Pieper and his classical concept of leisure. So Pieper tells us that leisure is a condition of the soul. At the heart of leisure lies festival, in which three important concepts come into one: the relaxation, the effortlessness, and the ascendancy of being at leisure. Yet this festival or celebration, Pieper describes, derives its whole justification from divine worship. Leisure can only, he says, quote, leisure can only be made possible and justifiable on the same basis as the celebration of a festival. That basis is divine worship. He goes on to write, quote, the celebration of divine worship, then, is the deepest of springs by which leisure is fed and continues to be vital. Thus, this condition, Pieper argues, requires a soul that celebrates the existence of and rejoices in God. But to Pieper, divine worship is also a special time of no work, such as a Sabbath, that gives vitality to a spiritual attitude of leisure that permeates all areas of life. He says, quote, and similarly, in divine worship, a certain definite space of time is set aside from the working hours and day, a limited time specially marked off. This is similar to Duhon's arguments in Leisure, a Spiritual Need, which centers worship of Christ at the core of one's life that sets one's soul at rest, permeating into all other areas. Pieper's idea of worship and leisure, it also means that worship involves sacrifice. He says, sacrifice is the living heart of worship. He goes on, what does sacrifice mean? It means a voluntary offering freely given. It definitely does not involve utility. This leads Pieper to say, quote, culture depends on leisure for its very existence, and leisure in turn is only possible if it has a strong and vital link to divine worship. But it is also understood that Pieper's definition of worship may not be the same as contemporary worship services. It may go beyond this. First of all, his work was very informed by his Catholic beliefs, and it was also written in a very different context than ours in post-war Germany. Worship services are probably only one aspect of what Pieper would have considered worship. His notion of divine worship probably would have included Catholic traditions, the seventh-day feasts, and communal celebrations as a part of divine worship. However, the worship service on a Sunday is likely still an important part of this day. And so we can use his concept of leisure as a state of being that arises through this worship as a measure of sorts when comparing the spaces that Christian worship occurs in. In this presentation, we will consider the racial dynamics and prejudices that can find their way into the walls of worship services. Now we will look at some of the theories in contemporary leisure studies. So undoubtedly, hostile environments tainted with racism affect how we interact collectively, including in our leisure. So how have ethnic minorities responded to discrimination against multicultural forms of worship? Floyd and Stokolsta in 2014, they presented 5 theories of racial and ethnic adaptation in leisure, but 2 are particularly. That look okay? You guys can see that?
Yes.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, undoubtedly, hostile environments tainted with racism affect how we interact collectively, including in our leisure. How have ethnic minorities responded to discrimination against multicultural forms of worship then? Floyd and Stokolsta presented 5 theories of racial and ethnic adaptation in leisure, but 2 are particularly important or relevant to this discussion. The first on the left is assimilation and acculturalization. This entails minority groups acquiring the dominant group cultural characteristics so that they can overcome cultural and structural impediments to enjoy full participation in society. It can be used as a coping strategy for avoiding discrimination in public spaces. It has been said by Christian scholars that this is actually the most common approach to multicultural worship services in North America, whereby the worship styles reflect the ethnic majority, slowly diminishing the worship cultures of ethnic minority members. Secondly, ethnic boundary maintenance is a process of insulation of cultures from confrontation or modification. Ethnic boundary maintenance is also very common within the church setting in North America. Sadolska explains that in the face of discrimination against Black Americans, whether inside or outside of the church, Black congregations have historically set themselves apart, creating safe havens for themselves in the face of ongoing racism and oppression. This process of ethnic boundary maintenance within Christian communities has been described as the creation of Exodus congregations by some. Racial dynamics and racial injustice have everything to do with these patterns, even in the body of Christ. MacDonald states, quote, rather than simply describing what whiteness is, it can be more useful to explain what whiteness does, end quote. So then we can ask, what is whiteness doing in spaces of worship? How is the inner worship of ethnic minority groups affected by processes of assimilation that they are expected to undergo in worship services? Thus, what whiteness does in the church and what it means for our attainment of classical leisure should be explored. Next, we will look at a case study recounted in Priest and Neves 2006, where two South Carolina pastors persuaded their congregations that desegregating the 11 o'clock Sunday morning hour, as Martin Luther King Jr. stated, would demonstrate to a wider world that unity in Christ dissolves racial boundaries. This case study presents excellent examples for explaining the Christian classical leisure concept and the two leisure participation models that we just looked over. I'll give a bit more background on this case study before we dive into the findings. So this attempted church merger was between two churches. Fellowship Church was a predominantly Black congregation, Community Church, a predominantly white congregation. Before officially merging, they had a 1-month trial period where they had worship services together each Sunday. By the end of the trial period, the Community Church, minus one vote that abstained, voted in favor of the merger, while Fellowship Church's congregation voted 2-1 against the merger. The predominantly white congregation was clearly convinced that the merger was a good idea, but clearly the majority of the predominantly Black congregation was against it. Why? Well, a major reason was because the Black church congregation was expected to assimilate to the worship practices of the white church congregation, reflecting the theory of assimilation and acculturation. We know that Black congregants of Fellowship Church did not feel welcomed, at ease, nor at peace when worshiping alongside white folks who were not receptive to the Black folks' expression of worship. They did not feel as though they could worship God in the depths of their being. This incident also likely impacted the classical leisure of white congregants of Community Church as well, and we'll explore this a bit more as we go. But in the face of the assumption that Black congregants would assimilate to the practices of the white church, the Black church congregants did not want to be a part of the church. Therefore, the situation easily became a good example of continued ethnic boundary maintenance as well. Although these observations cannot be generalized by any means, the situation does seem to fit a pattern that many Black Christians in America have experienced within the church. So there are two main findings after tying these three exploratory themes together. The centering of whiteness in worship can lead to, in this case scenario, valuing expertise over experience and an ahistorical approach to multi-ethnic worship. We'll start with expertise over experience. One of the contributing factors of the decision not to merge the Fellowship and Community Church congregations was the difference in worship styles. During the trial period where worship services were spent together, there were constant conflicts as to who was to lead worship. The worship leader at the Black church, Fellowship Church, had done so for years. She was well liked, she was good at it, even though she did not have a music degree. But her experience was disregarded by worship leader of the white church, who did have a music degree himself. The researcher described that at Fellowship Church, serving on the worship team was based on giftedness, experience, and age. But at Community Church, service rested on formal credentials, professional training, and technical expertise. At one point, the pastor of the Black congregation explained that worship involves the body in motion. Worship is loud praise. This is very different than the community church's understanding of worship as reverence. But when the fellowship worship leader tried to involve some of the bodily attributes of her own congregation's worship into the trial merger services, she was reminded repeatedly by the white church that ministry was not performance. Ultimately, the white congregation members did not have to change the way that they worshiped during the trial merger, but Black congregants did. Worship services throughout the trial merger matched the white church's style, reverent and silent. This is a quote from Preston Neves. Fellowship members began to drop out of the choir with comments like, "I just can't sing that white music." Verbal affirmations during services greatly decreased as well. In one sermon prior to the merger at Fellowship Church, members responded verbally 138 times. In a sermon preached during the merger, there were only 34 verbal responses. This situation, although it can't be generalized, is not unique. Black gospel worship has been disregarded by white Christians and seen as an informal means of worship for a long time. Watley in 1989 claimed that it is a common mistake for white people to misinterpret Black worship and gospel as a form of entertainment rather than a sacred anthem of praise. Van Opstal in 2020 explained that for centuries, racial and ethnic minorities have been told that their dances and instruments are not right, and ultimately that their forms of Christian worship are just not right. She says the white way has been seen as the standard for worship for a long time. In this case study, the high value placed on expertise that the white congregation upheld discounted the very culture of the Black congregation's worship. Evidently, there were barriers that prevented congregants from tapping into people's condition of the soul in that worship space. So much so that the Black congregation was not convinced that these barriers would decrease if they did merge. Additionally, the insistence on expertise in believers' worship also harms those who abide by it. Though not specific to the church, Pieper did have something to say about the overemphasis of expertise, or as he writes, intellectual activity. He thought that Kantianism, based on reason and logical frameworks, diluted our sense of selves to only workers. Pieper writes, quote, "The tendency to overvalue work and the effort of doing something difficult is so deeply rooted that it even infects our notion of love. If we must toil to achieve the perfect sounding worship to fit the standards we ourselves created, and it impedes our notion of love of welcoming other worship expressions, I would argue that this is at best a form of legalism, but at worst, it can be a continuation of racism. Therefore, an emphasis on expertise within white churches also hurts their own congregations by over-applying this same attitude of intellectual activity to their praise to God. This difference in value matters because it is the emphasis on effort and struggle in the form of accumulating expertise in worship that impacted the white church's understanding of love during this merger. The differences in the expression of worship between fellowship and community church also leads us to question why the values of worship styles are so drastically different between congregations that evolved in the same society. But one simple answer is that they have different meanings of worship. There are many more scholars who know far more about this than I, but in brief, Black worship music and gospel in America developed from a place of suffering. From slavery to the Jim Crow movement to ongoing police brutality, worship for Black Americans evokes communal memories of a God who has been strengthening them throughout their communal suffering. Many Black gospel songs have been dedicated to lifting one another up and reminding each other of their worth that God bestows on them. Many of these songs are steeped in a history of the paradox of oppression from people among them, but deliverance from a God who sees them. Conversely, worship songs and lyrics of the white church in America tend to be less communal and do not bring about as many collective memories of suffering. Songs are not sung as much about affirming the worth in each other as songs are sung to remind themselves of their own sin and the salvation that Jesus offers. McCarran in 2014 said, quote, "Worship has become a place of exclusion rather than embrace, end quote. Ethnic minorities are expected to assimilate and if not, leave. American history, which is stained with ongoing racism, does inform this process, and it can't really be separated from it. An interesting tie to classical leisure in this case scenario is that Pieper is of the belief that being at rest in one's soul is what prepares someone to be able to accept the struggles of reality. Without using the language of classical leisure, Whatley makes a strong argument that Black congregations in America have attained classical leisure within Exodus congregations that they have created in the face of racism. He explains that Black churches in America have become places to grapple with truth of suffering while still learning to communally worship the risen Lord together. In this way, it is very likely that ethnic boundary maintenance has worked to provide a safe space, allowing a Christian classical form of leisure to flourish. But perhaps the same cannot be said for ethnically homogenous white churches, because in this case scenario, in this case study, enclosure of their worship service happened because their actions had adamantly maintained their comfortability, whereas Black congregants left because their presence was not affirmed. Community churches' worship did not involve sacrifice, which, remember, Pieper describes as, quote, a voluntary offering freely given. Instead, they assumed that they could merge without making sacrifices in worship styles. Another reason why Christian classical leisure may not be fully attained for white congregants in this case study was because of another component of the classical concept of leisure, which we haven't focused on much, but that is the pursuit of truth and morality. Realistically, churches should be the first places that are practicing this classical form of leisure, one that bravely grapples with truth, seeks reconciliation, repents, and presses into understanding of the dynamics of ongoing racism. But perhaps the songs sung in predominantly white congregations may give us a hint as to why these things aren't happening as much as they should be in the church. As I said before, much of the worship lyrics in churches is self-centered. Miller and Van Opstal describes this as the Jesus and me complex, describing that white worship is often centered upon the individualistic and personal relationship with Christ, rather than what that relationship means for the way that one loves and lives out justice in the community around them. As Christians, Pieper affirms that moral goodness comes effortlessly when we are rooted in love. Love and reverence for our Lord must be the reason that we worship. But mustn't we also ensure that our worship spaces allow our brothers and sisters to do the same? When white Christians ask this question genuinely, it may lead us to take action in our congregations ourselves. One final quote from this case study that I will just say is, instead of providing a safe space for valued expressions of worship that received intervalidation by others, the merged church for many fellowship members became a setting where space was denied to them in their practices, or where valued practices received ambiguous or negative assessments. When one expects mutual affirmation within the framework of shared aesthetic values and receives instead judgment and criticism, solidarity does evaporate. This was not an isolated case study. It was an attempt at reconciliation, at building solidarity after decades of distance, but it did reflect a similar pattern that many attempts at racial reconciliation can spark. That is, the marginalized group is expected to meet the standards and fit the expectations of the majority group in order to fit in. Because true compromise was not sought, where there would have to be sacrifice from both ends to merge worship styles, there was no basis for trust to be earned. To summarize this section, as the trial merger panned out, there was an assumption from community churches, leadership, and congregants that their worship traditions, which prioritized a worship style rooted in expertise and had an ahistorical understanding of worship, were more legitimate. Ways forward. Now, again, I'm no expert, but as I was doing my research, I did come across two themes that did seem to be great suggestions as to what white Christians could do, either as individuals or as part of a congregation, looking to produce this worship space that welcomes multi-ethnic expressions of worship. First, to celebrate diversity in places of Christian worship, Haldeman affirms that learning and doing the work of learning is of utmost importance. He says, quote, we must reckon not so much with differences in style in the present, with various ways of singing and praying and teaching, as with the violence of our shared past, which must be named in order for reconciliation to be possible. Secondly, making more room for embodiment in our worship services is recommended. Julia Williams insists that when marginalized groups enter spaces of worship in North America, they often undergo an embodied memory of violence against their bodies. Ethnic minorities must be affirmed of their worth and their invitation into spaces. And so I'll just really quickly go over these because I know I just hit the 30-minute mark. The first is, sorry, 1 second. I forgot a point. Worship, as Bieber describes, gives vitality to leisure, which is a state of being, which transcends into all other areas of life. But his definition does go beyond worship services. However, if the worship services of many Americans are unwelcoming to certain legitimate worship expressions, it must be difficult to feel as though one's worship is actually truly meaningful. And so the three takeaways here. The first, differences in worship styles between different racial or ethnic minority groups within a society where there is a strong cultural and ethnic majority can cause minority groups to focus on themselves to avoid assimilation. This is the ongoing pattern of ethnic boundary maintenance. Secondly, we must learn our history, be aware of continued racism, and let that shape our actions and approach to worship services. Refusing to confide into racialized stereotypes, the creation of an other, and can wrongfully center the white way as truth. Thirdly, the work of Pieper could be helpful for Christians to provide a basis for what worship is, how it cultivates leisure as a state of being, and how to be conscious in making worship services welcoming to different expressions of worship. I had a couple ideas for future research, but I will skip those unless someone wants to ask a question about it. But I invite you into the time of question and response. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Jenna. All right, questions for Jenna for this discussion. Joey, please.
Hi, Jenna. First off, great presentation. Listening to you, you did a lot of great work there. I know that this was a case study, but in your research, were you able to find what a multicultural or multiracial church looked like and what they can do to get to that point where they were breaking down those barriers?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. One of the scholars that I found came up the most when I was typing in some of the research terms was Haldeman, Scott Haldeman. And I believe he was a Presbyterian minister. And so he did a lot of writing about ethnic, multi-ethnic worship services. And although he didn't give a lot of like how-tos, he did mention a lot of giving up and sacrificing what he grew up with in terms of what he thought. He had to like go through the thinking of what he thought was a successful worship service and kind of like deconstructing a bit of that to be able to make room in his congregation and in his leadership team to be able to invite different expressions of it. And so one of his recommendations, like super small, was just inviting congregations to be more vocal and having more vocal responses in church services. That's just an example of embodiment. But he was big on embodiment, and there were a couple others like Julia Williams, who I mentioned as well. But I didn't end up finding like an example of a church that was super descriptive of how they have done so. I was more so just trying to make the ties, but it is a good question, and it would be interesting to look at that as well.
Awesome. It seems like it's very it kind of goes countercultural to the American culture of getting more towards the collectivist than the individualist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, other questions? Yes, Matt.
Thanks, Jenna, for your presentation. My name, I don't know. Enjoyed your presentation. Me and my student here from the cornfields of Indiana, so good to see some Canadians here. I was wondering, I thought about this a lot, and this is common in higher education. I think in Christian higher education, we're in the cornfields of Indiana. So particularly racial diversity is not like it's a very, it's the cornfields of Indiana. So it's mainly white. But I also realized like that's not necessarily a bad thing. Different countries and different parts of different countries are very, black or brown or what have you. And I think that's okay. So one of the questions I've struggled with is to how much should we work to integrate in various cultures, and how much should we realize or try to realize, or is it an issue in a sense that it's like, Indiana's pretty white. Certain cities in the South are pretty black, and that's okay. And so like, what's the, if you will, like prescription, same thing with church. It's like, our church is planning to be really ethnically diverse because it's a really, really white town. So what would you suggest for places like that are just not racially diverse in general, but could still be more racially sensitive or diverse in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's, it also points to, geography, and I don't know a ton about American geography either. And I'm no expert on this, so these are really just like ideas that come into mind. But I would say that you don't want to force, like if Indiana really, if there really is no, like not a lot of diversity in your town or your city, then I would say there's not much you can do in terms of inviting, as long as you are continuing to make that space inviting in case there are groups that may not feel welcome. But if to your knowledge you are extending that invitation, then I think that you don't want to force and say, hey, you got to come to my church and you got to move cities in order to come and make my church, like that becomes a bit of tokenism, right? And so I would say one thing that came to mind, I think and can be a really cool way of learning, is getting youth groups to do like exchanges and to have churches that are partnered together, maybe in states that are or parts of America that are very monoracial, to be able to partner ongoing and just have exchanges each year, either doing like service projects together or something where they can learn from each other and you can bridge that divide. But that's just a thought. But I think the worry is that you don't want to get into tokenism and saying, I want these people to come to my church just so I can reach that diversity quota. Like that's absolutely not the heart of Jesus when he has talked about inviting people in. And I don't think that's what, inviting people from every nation and every tongue looks like in Revelation. And so just keeping that your heart welcoming and open and not, I think especially, sorry, I'm getting a little rambly here, but one thing that did strike me was just asking ourselves, like, what are we holding to in terms of worship services? When I was looking at this case study, it really did seem like the predominantly white church was really, really firmly holding on to what they called as good worship, and they had good reason for it, right? Like they said, well, I have a degree, and so I'm the one who knows most. But really keeping that like a heart of openness and of invitation in our congregations, and how do we do that? So I don't know if I'm really no expert, but those are just some of my thoughts. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, Jenna, excellent job in what like grace and calm collectiveness you had in the midst of everything that went on, and to be able to pop right back in and keep your presentation going. So that was awesome. My question is kind of to follow up with the last question. What about when, in terms of cities or areas that are actually very diverse, is there ever a point that you found kind of during your research where it's like, hey, yeah, we could do this multicultural kind of aspect, and while we would even be open to that and the blendedness of it, we can let a church, or not even to say let, but it's better to let that be where they have full aspects of their culture, not a blended part where, hey, we sacrifice this and this congregation sacrificed that. Not even saying that they're unwilling. Maybe both participants or both congregations are fully ready to do that. They're ready to, for the sacrifice. Is there ever a point in which that is kind of stripping someone of at least partial culture, where maybe fellowship or community would be one thing, but full integration is not as beneficial?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Haldeman, who I came across, Scott Haldeman, did have a few things to say about that as well. He talked about how, I forget what he worded it, but when it's building sharing, where churches of different nationalities, basically, there would be a service in a different language in the same building that was a different congregation rented out. And he did research on building the bridges between those congregations, even if they're not the same congregation, and having just points of interaction and of shared service or sharing meals together, to really make sure that the invitation to know each other and to love each other is there, and there's not a strict cut and wall between the two congregations. So that was interesting. And I also think that when we live in a multicultural country such as Canada, a lot of times there's a lot of comfort found in certain ethnicities having their own services and having their own congregations. And it can be kind of a refresher, maybe if they face racism or just don't get to speak their language throughout the week. So I do think that there is space for that as well. But I think that making sure that the connection points between congregations is also really important. And if there are ethnic minority groups in a church that is predominantly white, making room for different expressions of worship during that service. And that's kind of more what I was focused on. But I do think that your question is a great one. And I don't think churches should be forced to merge if they both are comfortable not. So those are just my thoughts, but thank you.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks.
All right, we are out of time for this presentation. Jenna, thank you again for not only giving us a great presentation, but working through the thunderstorms of your life to help you get through and continue. We appreciate that perseverance that you have, and we look forward to great additional information from you in the future. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being patient through it all.
All right, we're going to take